All right, we are live. So
Great.
with that, Donald, why don't you get us started?
Terrific.
An introduction.
Well, welcome everybody. We have a small but enthusiastic group here. My name is Donald Romanick, and I am president of the Episcopal Church Foundation. And ECF is an independent lay-led organization, and we work with Episcopal faith communities of all sizes and shapes on vision and planning, leadership, and financial resource development. And we do that through a variety of programs and initiatives, and you can find out all about that on our website. And what we do on a regular basis are web-based teachings and webinars, and we started the idea of a book study recently, and we got some positive response, and we thought it would be fun to do it again. So this is our second, and Miguel will say a little bit about our book studies and also introduce our author tonight.
Yes.
So, thank you, Miguel.
Thank you. And my name is Miguel Escobar, and I serve as Managing Program Director here for Leadership and External Affairs. And as Donald was mentioning, this is only our second book discussion that we're trying out. And this is the first time also in which we have the author of the book that we're going to be discussing, which is The Restoration Project, the Reverend Christopher Martin. And so I would actually ask if maybe, Christopher, you could introduce yourself just a little bit and if you could say just a few words about why you chose to focus on Benedict's 12 Steps of Humility in your book.
Sure. So I'm Christopher Martin, and for the past 13 and a half years, I've been the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in San Rafael, California. Before that, for 5 years, I was associate of at first 20s, 30s ministry and then discipleship group ministries at All Saints Beverly Hills. And before that, for 5 years, I was at first seminarian and then curate at Christ Church Cathedral in Hartford, where I got to know Donald Romanick, which was great. So I'm in the first instance, I'm a parish priest, an Episcopal priest. The seed for this book was a book that I was reading called A Guide to Living in the Truth by Michael Casey. And it was a commentary on Benedict's 12 Steps of Humilities. And I loved it. I loved it personally. And I would copy pieces of it and share it with people and say, oh, isn't this amazing? And people didn't get it. And, they couldn't understand what was going on. And as I looked at it, I realized that a lot of the wisdom there required having done some study in it and had some exposure to monastic communities. And I thought, oh, this is such great stuff. It needs to be spread wider. So what motivated me to first start working on the book was to try and share its wisdom with the people I was serving, first at All Saints Beverly Hills and then here in San Rafael. Great.
Thank you. I thought that we could just begin by lifting up three ideas. I mean, this book covers a wide range of ideas, but there were three that struck me in particular. And the first is you write about individual practices at the very beginning, the individual practices of praying 20 minutes a day, and then also a regular practice of serving the poor. And I thought you made a really wonderful and careful distinction of, serving the poor is different than serving on a board that serves the poor. You're talking about direct service. And so I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about both of those practices, those individual practices.
Sure. 20 minutes was something that I came to almost accidentally. That if you know about Thomas Keating's practice of centering prayer, a meditation sit is 20 minutes. So I just picked up on that and said, when I started sharing this with people, look, not everybody's called to that particular practice, but whatever you do for prayer, do it for 20 minutes. And I was part of a conference about Christian practices, and there was a professor there, an Episcopalian actually, Richard Pease from Fuller Seminary, and he asked me, where did you come up with 20 minutes? And I said, well, it just kind of made sense. It was a good thing. He said, because we've actually done research, and people who pray for 20 minutes or more a day express a much higher level of satisfaction with their prayer life So there seems to be something about 20 minutes that makes a big difference. And as for praying daily, that's just, kind of a typical admonition. And it's a kind of thing, as I've led hundreds of people actually at this point into a rhythm of prayer. And people regularly report that it just makes a big difference in their life, not just in those 20 minutes, but in the tenor and tone of the whole experience. It's a lot easier to pray without ceasing if you've got a regular place to start. As for serving the poor face to face, I think mostly I can just speak on a personal basis that for me, the two ways in which I've served the poor in Marin County are that I helped host a support group for teen moms and their children. Now, that's one of the ways. And one of the great fruits has been I now see those moms and their children in the shopping mall or whatever. And we know each other. We have stories that we share back and forth. The kids come up and hug me. So it feels like this moment of neighborliness, of reconciliation, of going beyond boundaries that are otherwise set up in our society. So it's a deep kind of healing that happens only relationally. And my sense of expanding into more of God's beloved humanity is even more when I go 4.5 miles down the road to San Quentin prison and visit guys on death row. And it's not only the guys that I visit, but it's who I'm waiting in line with, who are coming from all over, and from many of them from real poverty and real beleaguered communities in California. And there we all are waiting in line together. And that's just a fundamentally different feeling than being in our various socioeconomic bubbles. So that fruit's only going to happen if you have these kinds of face-to-face relationships with others.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add is that most of us are going to be drawn more to the life of prayer or to the life of service. Part of the challenge of the Restoration Project is to say for all of us, it's both. And so that's always going to be a way to keep stretching and growing in our relationship with God.
So in addition to these individual practices, so you start off with these individual practices, but then you kind of put the rest of the book is almost kind of weighted on the group discipleship, the discipleship groups rather, and kind of the accountability that's created in groups. So I'm wondering, so could you just, for someone who say hasn't necessarily read the entire book, can you just describe what those groups are and kind of how that functions, perhaps in your congregation or in other congregations?
Sure, and it is both in my congregation and in other congregations. It's the core of the Restoration Project movement, is trying to invite more and more people to get into these structured small groups. So one of the insights that I learned about 15 years ago when I visited a high commitment church called Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., is that small groups always become self-support groups, or only self-support groups, unless they're structured towards something else, structured towards mission and maturity in the case of discipleship groups. And so having a structure that holds us accountable to growth seemed really important right from the start. Structure is what holds us to our best intentions as we die to our old selves and are reborn in Christ. And so having these small groups of accountability that grow in trust over time is, I think, an essential piece for our personal growth. It's just a real gift to have people who know us and know our struggles over time, know our stories, and can hold us accountable to not only the practices, but what they've heard us say before. And maybe we're not practicing the way we used to, or maybe we're down in the dumps and we're going in a certain direction, and they can say, hey, remember, back a year ago when you were doing this, you were really coming alive then. Where is that in your life now? That kind of thing is just such a gift.
I just want to reach out to the participants while we're having this conversation with Christopher. If you have any questions for him, I just have one for you. Even if you haven't read the entire book, were there any practices or ideas that especially resonated with you, especially some of the personal practices? And which of some of the practices, either the group or the individual ones, did you especially find challenging or you struggled with? Christopher, I'm going to read you a paragraph from your book, and there was a lot of good stuff, but I found this especially compelling because for me, it tied together what's happening in the discipleship groups with the wider faith community. So this is on page 64, and it says, churches should always be two things simultaneously: schools for saints and hospitals for sinners. On the good side, they ought to be schools helping to draw out of us our best, teaching us the skills and practices that help us in imitation of our Lord to be humble, loving, and wise. At the same time, in an acknowledgement of the broken place where each of us starts, it ought to be a hospital. There's much sickness in us that needs to be healed on our way to sanctity, and it will take time. In any church, we are always going to be surrounded with other recovering sinners like ourselves. Among the great gifts we can give each other is to release the temptation to grumble at each other's brokenness. So, one of the things you do kind of focus on is one of the practices is to wrestle with your sins or wrestle with the fact that you're a sinner. And in light of that quote about the role of the larger faith community or the church, how does this all fit together?
Wow. There's a lot there, and I think it starts with me because there was a lot in that paragraph. I think we need each other to work through our broken places, both to love us as we're trying to become better people, and also to reveal us to ourselves, people who know us honestly enough to tell us when we're not doing things quite right is an enormous gift. Somebody who can lovingly tell us, when you talk like that, this is how I hear that, and that's not the most helpful thing. We need that in order to see who we are. That was also in the context of the fourth step, I think, which is patience. And, one way to learn patience is to just tell yourself internally when you're joining a community or in a relationship, like, there are going to be some hard parts and I'm going to need to stick with it if I'm really going to bear the fruit of this and really become the loving person I'm called to be.
I also like the reference to grumbling, and you did talk about grumbling in other parts of the book, and grumbling seems to be part of maybe not the practices Benedict was advocating, but clearly a practice that we find in our congregations, and probably not only Episcopal congregations. I mean, how do we take the fact that grumbling also is a part of any community, but kind of make that more of a healthy sharing brokenness rather than kind of the parking lot conversations that we all participate in and hate at the same time.
First of all, it's striking when you read the whole of the Rule of St. Benedict, how often he mentions grumbling. So clearly it's just often it's not something that's for the building up of the body, and it's a sort of addictive behavior, the sort of thing that we actually just need to release and let go. And the kind of spiritual wisdom that I attend to is that the release of grumbling needs to start really very early on with our thoughts, like don't even let them come up, kind of thing. It's one thing to weep and wail like Job, if you've been hurt or if it's massive injustice, but it's quite another to sort of have that sort of toxic ongoing rant that does us no good and just doesn't build up the body. So maybe part of it is just naming, like, look, this is something that we do and it's just not helpful.
It's a good descriptor, grumbling. It's
yeah, it is. Or murmuring, as it says in Exodus very often. Same thing.
And Benedict certainly was writing about it in the context of community. I mean, in the context of obviously a community of brothers, and it's very alive in our attempts to form community as well today.
Yeah.
So I just want to repeat for those who are on, if you have a question or a comment, please type it into the chat box wonderfully. We do have a comment, as well as to the people who are joining us on Facebook Live. If you have a question or a comment, please type it into the comment section. We're watching both, and we'll be able to convey those questions and comments to Christopher and have him part of our conversation.
Beth, that's a great comment, and I'm going to even read it. I'm struggling with practicing sacred obedience. I'm too far away from a church to be active or join a group, which is why I have been excited about this webinar. It's hard for me to stay constant in my worship and prayer. And I guess I'll add on to Beth's comment. I think, there are times that even my own personal spirituality, especially around penitential seasons, I get into a rhythm and it's great. And as you said, 20 minutes of prayer a day makes a big difference, whether some of that is centering prayer or reading the daily office or Bible study. But then, like anything, it's like exercise or eating well. When you get away from it, how do you get back to it? For those people who feel, oh my God, I'll never be able to do this. This is so aspirational and it's wonderful, but where do I begin? Where my prayer life may be just kind of going to church and going through the motions and then going back to my busy life. And what if I am in a remote area where I don't have a sense of community, or if I ask people to join a discipleship group, they would look at me funny. What are some real kind of practical steps for people who just aren't there yet, but are struggling?
Well, it's first of all, the 7 vows are aspirational and are intended to be. Those of us who first wrote them when we first gathered and had a conversation, an honest conversation about where we actually were in relationship to the 7 vows, none of us was 7 for 7 or even close. It's something that one grows into. I just got a report from a relatively new discipleship group in Pittsburgh, and they spent about 6 months being intimidated by the vows, and then finally said, you know what, we're just going to spend the next couple of months and we're just going to focus on, and they picked one, prayer, for example. Now, I think prayer is a great first place to start. I think that's a really important engine that makes possible everything else. My hope is that giving the form and structure of a discipleship group would enable somebody who has a harder time going to church to still find a place to be in Christian community with other people. And I know of several very successful, thriving discipleship groups that have 3 people in them. So it doesn't have to be a big group. So it could be as simple as asking a couple of people who might be spiritually interested to give it a try and start off with prayer. Now, prayer is the place where I start most frequently with people because I feel like I can walk alongside them and coach them, and I have a way of doing that. So, if you can find somebody who can walk alongside you and guide you and encourage you, that would probably be helpful too.
Great.
Well, with the 3-person group with the rule of 3s, as you indicate, but I guess 3 people have more of a sense of commitment too. It's like when they say even a dinner with 3 people is better than 4 or 5 because there's an intentionality about making sure that you interact with both people. So it's kind of
it can work.
So here at the Episcopal Church Foundation, one of the areas that we really focus on is leadership and leadership broadly construed, lay leadership, clergy leadership, congregational leadership. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the connection between these practices of humility, to leadership in the congregation in life.
Yeah, I think one mark of a good leader is being able to discern when to lead and when to follow and when to get out of the way. And somebody who's not bringing a huge amount of extra ego baggage into situations, I think, is going to be, have eyes more for what the truth of a situation is, and to be more easily able to know whether they're called to go out front or to be quiet and listen, or to just get out of the way. So humility can help in that way. The other is that if you'll notice, the 4 highest steps of humility are all about being quiet in various ways. And I believe, particularly in our increasingly anxious and distracted time, that people who have that sort of strong, quiet center have the capacity to be real leaders in a whole variety of different ways, not least of which is psychological and spiritual. In church circles, we talk a lot about, especially because of Friedman, of the importance of being a non-anxious presence. Well, practicing the steps of humility enables us to be quiet, peaceful, non-anxious from our depths. And I think that can have a profound effect on any kind of situation or community. So those are 2 ways I think humility can help leadership.
We're all familiar with the fact that, there are a growing number of people who have no religious identity, the spiritual but not religious, the nuns, NONES. In terms of the types of people who are involved in the Restoration Project or kind of forming these discipleship groups, what are their demographic? At least the ones you've been working with or know about. Are they newcomers? Are they seekers? Are they old? Are they young? Are they churchy? Are they church geeks? Are they inherently spiritual? Or all over the board? I mean, kind of how are people entering this process, if you will?
Well, the bulk of the people who I know who are in discipleship groups are in discipleship groups as a result of my having gone and introduced the concept and talked people through it. I've led something like 9 or 10 clergy conferences at this point, and then I follow up. And so at the moment, most of the people are people who are fairly churched and are just hungry for the next thing and not knowing what that was going to be. And this structure gives them an opportunity to continue their growth in their faith, which, research has proven is essential to the stability and to the growth of churches. If there's a significant percentage of people within a congregation that are serious about the practices, that tends to have an impact beyond those who are actually doing it. So most of the people so far are churched. But there are some people who are relatively new who show up and say, oh, I'm looking only for things that are serious. These people are taking it seriously, and they sort of go from 0 to 60 miles per hour. An interesting story about that comes from Christ Church Cathedral in St. Louis, where Mike Kinman used to be. He's now at All Saints Pasadena. But when he was at the cathedral, he had a discipleship group that met after church and was a mix of some veterans and then some millennials who were newer to church. And he found that the millennials very often would skip going to church and go right to the discipleship group. Like that was the serious thing. So that's what they were going to go for right away. So there are little stories like that. I hope to see more of that as the movement continues to grow.
So how, there are a lot of places that have what they call foyer groups, or people get together, or book studies, or they get together once a month for potlucks. Obviously, this is more of a deliberate process. But what is the basic difference? And is this once you join one of these groups? Are you in it for the long haul? It doesn't sound like something you drop in and drop out of.
The intention is to be in there for the long haul. The conventional wisdom in small group ministry of any sort is the law of thirds, where a third of them are really going to click, a third of them are going to muddle along, and a third of them are never going to quite click. So the same thing is true with discipleship groups. The intention is the long term, but even with ones that really click, people move, people shift, people change. So I have one discipleship group here at St. Paul's that's been essentially the same group for the last 12 years. Wow. But then there have been lots of other groups that have come and gone in the meantime and have morphed as people have come and gone. So the intention is stability. the language in the vows is that we commit for this season of our lives. And that's intentionally vague because, life's going to happen. The chemistry is going to be there or it's not. But the invitation is to make it a more long-term commitment because we're trying to build trust here, deep trust, and that's only going to come over time.
We have a great question from Linda, one of our participants, about just wanting some specific ideas about creating groups at a congregation. How different congregations handle sign up, the invitation, time choices. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the logistics behind forming discipleship groups.
Well, the entryway into this work of the Restoration Project for most congregations is the basic ABCDs, which are a series of formation classes. But people kind of take those and tweak the curriculum in all kinds of different ways for their own teaching style and for what their community is like. But that very often will tell you who are the people who are interested in having spiritual conversations and learning more. I discovered early on that I was a terrible matchmaker. I kept thinking, I could call this person and that person and get them together and it would be great. I just never worked that way. So a lot of it for me is just being attentive to where are some relationships that are starting to evolve and how can I, is it the right time to say, well, you might want to try this. In terms of a program, the most successful thing that I found is the class Basic Discipleship, where it's more like a coaching than anything else, where I just meet with 2, 3, sometimes 4 people for 6 weeks in a row and focus in on getting into and maintaining that rhythm of 20 minutes a day of prayer. And we do a check-in every week. How many times did you meet? Or how many times did you pray? Where did you pray? What did you try? What worked? What didn't? Why? And then also each person telling 3 stories from their life of when they felt closest to God, which starts getting us used to being a little bit more vulnerable. And then also telling those kinds of stories that we don't tell just anybody because sometimes they're very eerie and vulnerable experiences. So that's a kind of run up. So very often groups that have done that basic discipleship, there's been a little bit of trust that has been built. And so that can become a discipleship group. And then they invite maybe some other people who maybe haven't done any of these classes, but they just are as a friend that they feel that might be ready to join such a thing. It's kind of like organic gardening, right? There's no like strict formula. You have to attend to what the soil and the sun and all that stuff is like. So same thing is true with our communities.
Is there let me ask you, especially in your own congregation, especially since you're kind of clearly a mover and a shaker in this project, can there be a sense of kind of exclusivity? Like if you're in a parish or congregation, you're either in a discipleship group or not in a discipleship group. And if you're in Christopher Martin's parish, and if you're not in a discipleship group, you're clearly among the goats and not among the sheep. Or, could there, because I know that was somewhat of a problem when Curcio was very popular. Right. Curcio almost became kind of, I don't want to say cult, but I'll say cult, where Curcio people like hung out together at diocesan conventions and, ate at separate tables and drank separate wine and all that kind. How do you avoid that kind of self-selection resulting in yet again another opportunity for congregations to split into interest groups?
Pastoral care and spiritual generosity. That's absolutely a huge concern when things first got started. I remember I got a long note from one of our matriarchs after the first discipleship group started, because she kept hearing about how the first discipleship group, when they gathered, would eat Jay's chili, which evidently was outstanding. And she was like, I want some of Jay's chili. Why can't I have it? And, I should be able to have that too. And this is going to create a spiritual elite and it's going to separate. And, I had to write her back to say, I can totally see how that could be a possibility. So let's proceed being very careful to make sure that doesn't happen. And, I'm pleased to report that eventually 3 years or 4 years later, she found herself in a discipleship group also, and she loves it. So it took some time, and it just took some walking side by side with people. I could see how that could be a fear. we just keep opening the door for people to do this and make it clear that it's not a shame thing. It's like, when you're ready to take this step, this is a way to do it. The biggest fruit in our parish, or one of the biggest fruits, is just the sheer number and depth of the outreach projects that have emerged. And people who are in discipleship groups and not in discipleship groups are working shoulder to shoulder to serve hot breakfast to the probationary teens at the school. So they still have these other ways of connecting that isn't just about discipleship groups.
Great, thank you. We have we have two actually wonderful questions. I'm going to go with the person who wrote first on Facebook Live. Michael wrote. He's a seminarian from Yale Divinity School. He wondered if you could speak about developing accountability in discipleship groups. How do you hold members accountable to their commitments in light of the many demands in our life?
Well, in light of the many demands in our life, that's just a very deep question, right? We all have 24 hours, and what are we going to prioritize, and how are we going to prioritize it? And, discipleship groups work through cognitive dissonance. At some level, maybe, I hope, you read the vows and you think, Jesus did teach that. It is in the scripture, and maybe I ought to be doing it. But of course, we're all going to wrestle with that, and we're all going to wrestle with different ones about that. In terms of how that happens, what's evolved over time is that discipleship groups tend to grow in 3 phases at the beginning. In the first phase, we spend several weeks being honest with each other about where we are in relationship to the 7 vows. And so everybody knows kind of where everybody is. And that's a practice that even if we move on to other things, we come back to from time to time, maybe once a year or so, like, where are you with that? This is where you were a year ago. How's that going for you? So that's one of the ways it's accountable. They then shift to people, each person sharing their spiritual autobiography and everybody else just listening. So accountability gains some depth and richness and nuance once we come to know the whole story of somebody. So our holding people accountable or loving them through change has a fullness to it that it wouldn't otherwise have. And then the third phase is, once you know where you are in relationship with the practices, once you've been able to share your story, is to share what you think God might be calling you to, what your gifts are, what you think God might be calling you to. And again, the group can, over time, have the function of encouraging more often than not, but then also reminding you, this is what you said. Where is that? How's that going?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether or not this is Michael's, this would be Michael's question. I mean, one question I guess that I would have kind of as a follow-up is just the very practical sort of situation of someone having made this commitment and then not showing up, not being able to show up multiple times. And, how is that when the group reminds them? I'm sure it depends on each group, but surely that's an issue that's faced.
Yeah, and then you just need to have the conversation. Maybe this isn't the group. Maybe this isn't the time.
Yeah,
that's okay. I mean, no point in using shame at that point. It's just naming what seems to be the reality of the behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are going to come and go, and some groups are going to, as I said before, some groups are going to come together and they're going to click, and some of them aren't. This is a high maintenance way of operating.
Yeah, it's a high commitment, it sounds like. Yeah. A second question from one of our participants, Beth, kind of goes back to this question of how discipleship groups differ from other types of small groups within the church. She shares that she's been part of EFM. I think this is Daughters of the, I don't know what a DOC means. The acronym, but are those similar? To my mind, it sounds. Disciples of Christ. Thank you.
Disciples of Christ in Community, I think, is DOCC's. But anyway, yeah.
So this question of kind of how does a discipleship group, in the way you're speaking of, differentiate from these others type of groups?
I'm not as familiar with the Disciples of Christ in Community. EFM, of course, is a 4-year formation program where you're learning a lot of information. It's kind of seminary for lay people, as far as I understand it. This is about holding us to kind of specific behaviors, and the invitation to prayer is just as important as the invitation to serve the poor. It's deliberately intended to be a discernment community. The sixth vow is, I'm going to hear within the context of my group what my call is and follow it. So I'd say it's more behaviorally oriented than EFM is. Curcio also has fourth day groups, and there's definitely some overlap and similarities there. But again, what distinguishes it is these 7 vows and the actual Christian practices that we're holding each other accountable to.
People are always looking for magic bullets to grow that and revitalize the church. Does this? I mean, I know this is not the purpose of it, but do you feel, or has there been some indication that this movement could actually revitalize the Episcopal Church, or at least hold us up as offering some alternatives to people who are seeking a deeper connection to God and a deeper understanding of who they are and what they're called to be?
That's certainly the intention, and early signs are, churches that are vital are embracing this, and they are becoming, I think, only more vital as a result. And the research out there, as I said earlier, says that if you've got Christians who are really vital and excited about that and growing themselves at the heart of a congregation, that tends to be compelling out on the margins as well. I also believe that this structure can be very helpful, partly because it's not so financially dependent. You don't need clergy. You don't need a church building to do this work. Those things help. I believe in both of them. I believe both of those things are tremendously helpful for us. But it starts us moving in a slightly different direction and shifts the conversation, I think, in what have to be some really helpful ways.
What I've always found where we kind of fall down on the job is really helping people connect how they live out their Sunday experience with their daily life and work.
Right.
And, and we try to, but this just seems like an opportunity to do that in a very, very specific, practical, yet spiritually grounded way.
Yeah.
This is another kind of weird question, but is there any kind of, discipleship group light, is there any way, can you do this kind of on the cheap or on the easy, or is part of the whole premise that this is a commitment that you really need to make?
No, it's a commitment that you really need to make.
Okay.
And the basic ABCDs are classes in the more standard way of doing it. They introduce indirectly what some of these things are. For example, in basic Bible, one of the vows is to learn the whole of Scripture. Well, how do you do that? Well, you need to have the tools. So the classes are a way to dip your toe in the water, which most people do. I mean, a lot of people take the classes, and it's not till several years later that they then feel ready to make the next step of joining a discipleship group. And again, the fact that at least at St. Paul's that we have all of these outreach projects, that's a way to get into it. That's another angle to get into this, to be serving with people shoulder to shoulder. So, one way is just to know that you're practicing at least some of the practices in the first place.
Well, I'm sure you have people who are actively involved in outreach, and this is a way they enter the discipleship groups. And
Right.
People who enter discipleship groups, and because that's a practice and a discipline, they engage in outreach activities as a result of that.
Right. Christopher, are you there? Well, it looks like we lost Christopher for a moment. We just got another question, so I'll just read it aloud as we wait. About which classes are needed before joining a discipleship group. Beth, it sounds to me, and maybe we'll wait until Christopher comes back on, but it sounded to me as if there aren't actually class requirements before joining. That there seems to be some courses that individuals do take, like basics of discipleship, but in some instances, people who are not taking that are able to join as well. So
have any of the, I mean, we heard from some Beth, but have any of the other participants been part of any group that they felt was similar or had the potential of kind of raising these issues of regular habits and disciplines and discipleship? I'd kind of be interested in that. He's back.
Let me, just 1 second.
We have 2 Christopher Martin boxes.
Okay, Christopher.
One of the questions, Christopher, was what classes are needed before joining a discipleship group? And are the classes kind of a mandatory aspect from your point of view, or are they just a way to enhance your experience?
No. One of the mistakes I made.
Oops.
Can you hear me?
No.
I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you.
Okay. Does this work any better?
No.
It sounds as if the microphone might be a little bit covered by something.
Evidently, this is a problem on the Macintoshes that I haven't solved yet, which is why.
Oh, really?
It's just conked out. So I'll just scream and hope that you can hear me.
Okay.
One of the mistakes I made early on was making the classes required, and that just stultified things. So again, I realized it had to be organic. So for some people, classes are the comfortable way to start getting introduced to things. For others, they just show up and they're ready to go, or they have a relationship with somebody who says, you got to come check this out, and that's what makes them go. And then later they take a class. So there doesn't seem to be a direct parallel. A lot of it's just keeping your heart open and keeping your eyes open and continually nurturing it.
Great. So let's, I don't know if when your phone comes back on, you may want to try to attempt to call in using the phone number in the instructions, because that'll allow us to hear you a little bit better as well. I think one of the questions I would have for, I think, participants is, just sort of if there are particular practices that you found compelling in this, especially, I will say, and I'm going to circle back to Christopher, I think one of the notes that was particularly interesting to me was this notion that Benedict has this special contempt for gyrovagues, I think is the right word, and it feels very it feels like something that's just sort of lots of people are gyrovagues. So I'm wondering if you could describe, I guess loudly, what gyrovagues are, and why Benedict might reserve the greatest sort of contempt for gyrovagues.
Well, one thing to know about Benedict in particular is that humility is one of his 3 main.
Yeah, I don't, Christopher. For some reason, we like it's even less now. So we'll, yeah. Let's see. It's very interesting. The audio is going even lower. Yeah. No, I can very barely hear you. If there's, I don't know if you have if your phone is recharged at all, available. No, not yet. Okay, it does take a moment.
We may need to kind of wind down. But do participants have any other questions? We can maybe arrange for Christopher to respond to you, in another time. But any other kind of comments, thoughts, or questions? I know some of you said you haven't read the book completely yet. I hope this session has encouraged you to read the book. And what it's encouraged me to do is just be a little more deliberate about my own personal practices and realize that the whole idea of doing this in community really has a lot of appeal. And especially for those of us who kind of work in the church, whether it's a parish setting or a place like ECF, it's very easy for us to kind of get so involved with the stuff that we don't realize that we as individual Christians laboring in the field need to kind of focus on these and seek community beyond work groups or task groups or team approaches to mission and ministry. But before we kind of close, does anyone else have any comments or questions? Christopher, how might people, maybe you can type in, love to hear some personal growth stories via their involvement in discipleship groups. That might be something that you can share with us and we can share with participants. How might people get in touch with you if they want to hear more about how to do this and the whole idea of the movement or participating in the movement? If you can maybe give us contact information or a web link or something like that, that would also be helpful.
Yeah, Christopher Note's email is great, and he includes his email there. And Linda, it sounds like you have you have some questions specifically about the kind of the logistics. I'd encourage you to just reach out to Christopher at his email. And so with that, I think Donald, why don't you close us out?
Yeah, no, we're sorry that it ended so abruptly, just when we were getting some momentum. But so this is why you need discipleship groups, because remote groups sometimes just don't work. And right. We can try to hold Christopher accountable for not having his phone charged at the time, but we are also going to be patient and gracious in this process. But anyway, thank you very much. He has a retreat at St. Paul's. Oh my goodness, when's that? In February. Maybe I can come to that. Send me information about that. Yeah, a way of connecting again. And maybe I'll learn to read lips in the process too. Anyway, thank you all for participating. Brendan, maybe you could put on the screen our link to how you access our other webinars and other resources. I've been very excited about this book study. We hope to continue this, and thank you for all those on Facebook Live and on the webinar tonight. We're sorry for the technical difficulties, but we thank you for your patience and your continued faithfulness. So with that, have a wonderful Thanksgiving, a blessed Advent, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all. Bye. Thank you, Christopher, especially. Bye. So I'm going to go ahead and close things out. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.